Hello, this is Ms. Dalton, and we're going to be talking about function characteristics in this video. So our goals are to analyze graphs of functions to determine the domain and range, zeros, increasing and decreasing intervals, local and global maximum and minimum, and positive or negative intervals. So we talked about this in the last video, but the domain is the x values, and that is left to right of a function. So we're going to be looking at some graphs, and you want to look at the left side to the right side of the function, and that is your domain. Then the range are the y values, and so when we're looking at a graph, we're looking from the bottom to the top, because again, we're going least to greatest. And the domain and range can also be written in inequality or interval notation, so you'll be looking at both of them in this video. And remember to always write your domain and range from low to high. All right, so let's look at just a couple more definitions. A function or part of a function is said to be positive if the y values are greater than 0 for a defined interval of the graph. So we'll look at an example of this in just a minute, but positive, that would mean that it is above the x-axis. A function or part of a function is said to be negative if the y values are less than 0. So that would be below the x-axis. Here's an example. So it says name the intervals on which the function is positive and negative. And so if you look, the negative part of the graph is from this point all the way over to this point. And so even though we can't tell exactly where it is, it looks to be at negative 4.75 all the way over to negative 1.25. The positive side of the graph is where it is above the x-axis, and we have two parts on this. We have this part that goes from there all the way over to here, so that's from negative 1.25 to 2, but then we also have this other part because it does go down and hit the x-axis, so we can't include that as the positive, but then we've got this part here from 2 to 4. Now let's look at what happens when it's increasing or decreasing. A function is said to be increasing if the y values are increasing as the x values increase from left to right. So we're looking at it from left to right. Think of it, if you're climbing a mountain, then that's going to be the part that's increasing. Function is said to be decreasing if the y values are decreasing. So I know this kind of is common sense, but you just want to make sure that you're looking at it from the left to the right. And some students do get confused between the positive, negative, and increasing, decreasing. So if we look at this example in terms of increasing and decreasing, if we're walking along this graph and we're looking from left to right, so as I'm walking along here, this is decreasing, okay? But then as I hit that point, now I'm going to start increasing. Then when I hit this maximum point, then I'm going to start decreasing again. And then last but not least, I will increase. Okay, we also have what's called the absolute or global minimum, which is the lowest point on the entirety of a graph. If the range is at negative infinity, there is no absolute minimum. So if the range keeps on going forever in the negative direction, then there's no absolute minimum. The absolute maximum is the highest point of the entirety of the graph. And if the range is going in the positive infinity direction, then there is no absolute maximum. Okay, so that was absolute maximum and minimum, and now we're looking at local minimum and maximum. The local minimum is the lowest point on a defined interval. So defined interval, that would be, if I'm just looking at one section of the graph, what is the minimum of that section? And then local maximum is going to be your highest point on a defined interval. That's going to be your local maximum. So if we look at this graph here, the absolute minimum and maximum, absolute minimum would be the very lowest point, which is right here. And then the absolute maximum would be right here. But a local minimum is this point right here, because if you think about it, that is the lowest point for this interval. So local is just looking at an interval. Okay, and then the last thing that you need to understand from this video, the last definition, is that the points where the graph of a function intersects the x-axis. There are several words that we use for this. It is zeros. It can be called zeros. It could be called x-intercepts. Or it can be called roots. Those all mean the same thing. It's all of these points here that cross or that hit the x-axis. The other thing is that you want to pay attention to is that when it's called a turning point is where it hits the x-axis and then it turns and goes the other direction. That's going to be considered a double root, and we'll talk about that more when we look at some factoring. Okay, don't forget to fill out your questions after this video, and I will see you in class.